I'll be exploring the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. First, let's look at our protagonists. Over here we have Soviet Ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin, and next to him we have his boss, the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who succeeds Joseph Stalin. On the bottom we have Cuban President Fidel Castro, who's a new character. He takes power in Cuba in 1959, but more on him later. Here we have Presidential Advisor Robert F. Kennedy, who is actually the brother of the US President John F. Kennedy. He's his closest advisor. Over here I have a photo of actually a satellite image of Europe. The United States, through NATO, had placed nuclear missiles in Turkey and, less importantly, in Italy. These Jupiter nuclear missiles had the capability of reaching far into the Soviet Union. They were a threat directly to the Soviet Union. Over here, I have a photo or a satellite image of the United States and Cuba, this tiny island nation down here. It will serve to be very important. It's going to be a very important location during the 13 days that we'll be exploring. It is actually about 100 miles off the southern coast of Florida. But before we look at the history, I would like to give you an idea of what kind of nuclear weapons we're dealing with. We're not dealing with the ones that had exploded at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. We are looking at weapons that had increased in power by about 75 times. We're talking about huge weapons. So I'm going to show a short clip that reveals what kind of power we're dealing with. By the way, over here are ships. They're full-size ship, capital ships. Very large. The initial explosion has engulfed the ships completely. The secondary explosion. And then we have a tertiary explosion. Alright, let's look at the causes. Do you recall the Vienna summit? Well, it's actually one of the causes of the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you can recall, the United States President John F. Kennedy had failed to make a strong impression on Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev is under the impression that he's dealing with an inexperienced, immature, weak young man. This almost resulted in the liquidation of humanity, as Kennedy would not tolerate this perception by Khrushchev. Next, in January, specifically on January 8th, 1959, Fidel Castro led his revolution into Havana, which is the capital of Cuba, having ended the corrupt regime of Fulgencio Batista, who was a close ally of the United States. In the wake of the toppling of Batista's regime, then U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered the CIA to begin training Cuban refugees and exiles, so those who had escaped or left Cuba after the Batista regime ended, specifically people who may have been rich, things like that, to go back to Cuba as guerrilla fighters against Castro. So why was Castro an enemy? Well, it's because he nationalized millions of acres of former American companies' land. American-owned sugar companies. He had bought oil from the Soviet Union and received credit from the Soviet Union. And when American oil refineries would not refine the oil, they too were nationalized. However, they were nationalized via militias that went and forcefully nationalized them. Also, when Castro came to New York, Eisenhower was too busy for him. When Castro, however, Khrushchev dearly welcomed him and gave him economic assistance. Castro became more and more closely aligned with the USSR. So, Eisenhower's response to Castro's actions were significant. Cuba, which had been the top supplier of American sugar, received a 95% cut from its biggest customer. Castro continues to nationalize $1 billion more in American companies' property, and then Eisenhower issues a full trade embargo and orders the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, which is the U.S. Foreign Intelligence, to train Cuban exiles and refugees to fight against Castro. Those exiles were essentially trained to be terrorists. They had planted bombs, they had burned sugar fields, they had burned many fields. The guerrillas had even managed to blow up a ship in Havana Harbor. And here some Cubans struggling to extinguish a fire that had been set in a sugar field. These guerrillas dealt many attacks on sugar fields, which were a critical income for Cuba. On March 4th, 1960, La Coubre, a Belgian cargo ship that contained arms and munitions, was blown up. This was, it had killed about 100 people. This is the sign of one of the American oil refineries as it is removed after being nationalized by Cuba, or by Castro. Alright, so now we have a significant turning point. This is the Bay of Pigs. In the face of such aggression from the United States, Castro actually turns to the USSR. Khrushchev was ready to help Castro. The CIA, however, was under orders to train more guerrillas for an invasion of Cuba. The hope was that the guerrillas, backed by American support, would be able to trigger a Cuban rebellion against Castro. Having finished his term, Eisenhower was replaced by a new, young, charismatic president, John F. Kennedy. Kennedy liked the idea of a Cuban-led invasion, but sought to downplay the role of the United States, and even to mask it. About 3 days before the operation began, Kennedy spoke at a press conference saying that the United States would not get involved militarily in China. And many plans were changed. The location of the invasion changed. The scope of American support had changed. So in mid-April, about the 15th to the 17th, the Cubans invaded Cuba, ironically as it sounds. The invasion was crushed within 3 days, as Castro had actually been preparing for a full-scale invasion by the U.S. military. His forces prepared accordingly, and they were only met with 1,500 guerrillas. So they were able to crush it rather quickly. In light of the American aggression, Castro declared that the revolution was a socialist one. This put a communist nation right at the doorstep of the United States. Here is that communist nation, and you can see the legend here shows that this distance is about 100 miles, so we can see that right from the tip of Florida, it's about 90 miles, 100 miles, give or take. Now, although Kennedy had promised to not have any American involvement in Cuba, it still happened. Here's the press conference where he announced it.
There will not be, under any conditions, be an intervention in Cuba by United States Armed Forces. And this government will do everything it possibly can, and I think it can meet its responsibilities to make sure that there are no Americans involved in any actions inside Cuba.
Clearly that didn't happen. So here are some Cuban guerrillas under supervision of the CIA training for an invasion of Cuba. Here is the Bay of Pigs. That's where the Cuban refugees, the Cuban guerrillas, had landed. The original invasion was supposed to be somewhere around here. However, it was canceled to mask American involvement. So what now? Castro had suppressed the force at the Bay of Pigs. However, he figured that the Kennedys were people who did not like to lose. He felt that Kennedy would try to fix the failure at the Bay of Pigs through a full-scale U.S. invasion. Castro therefore accepts Khrushchev's proposal to place medium-range nuclear missiles on Cuban soil. They were medium or intermediate range. The medium range came first. So this was a great development for Khrushchev. He saw in Cuba the opportunity to erase the psychological advantage that the United States has in having those missiles in Turkey so close to Moscow. So Khrushchev's plan to install nuclear missiles in Cuba would serve twofold. The first one would be to protect Cuba, deter a U.S. invasion of Cuba, and provide Cuba a defense against the United States should they invade. And number two, to threaten the United States with missiles that were actually closer than the ones in Turkey and Italy, therefore evening out the nuclear missile capabilities. As a matter of fact, the ICBMs, the intercontinental ballistic missiles that were in Soviet territory, would have made it to the United States with only 15 minutes of reaction time for the United States. However, these missiles in Cuba would grant only 1 minute of reaction time. So Khrushchev believed that such a strike capability in Cuba would enhance Soviet bargaining power with the United States in any future confrontation, such as during standoffs over Berlin, which we saw earlier in the Berlin crisis. It would afford a much more potent striking power against North America, reducing the warning time for a missile attack from 15 minutes to about 1 minute, seriously limiting the ability of the United States to deter or circumvent the launching of the missiles. Cuban missiles offered the sweetener from the Kremlin's perspective of increasing Cuban President Fidel Castro's public image and bolstering his influence in South Africa. And this quote is from JSTOR. Thus began the secret installation of medium-range missiles. Why was it secret? Well, up until now, the USSR had claimed that all weapons going to Cuba were of a defensive nature. This was in accordance with a Soviet policy that only obsolete weapons would be granted to other states. Khrushchev had boasted that the USSR did not even need to place nuclear missiles outside of Soviet territory, as the Soviet Union already had enough intercontinental ballistic missiles in Soviet territory so as not to require any more of them outside of the territory. So these missiles actually had this range. This is a rough indicator to show us how far these missiles could go. as you can see, they could take many American cities. Other diagrams show that they could reach beyond New York and Chicago, but even these ones, this diagram, a rather conservative diagram, I'll say, shows that Washington could easily be hit. Lots of Mexico could be hit. Most of the southern part of the United States could be hit. Here is actually another diagram. This one's from the Pearson textbook. Here is the range of the U.S. Jupiter missiles in Turkey. They could get this far in the Soviet Union. This is the range of the Soviet missiles based in Cuba. As you can see, it reaches almost to Newfoundland in Canada. Most of the United States is engulfed. All major cities have been are able to be hit, besides Seattle, Washington. So that's all in secret until now. Sadly for Khrushchev and Castro, the CIA started to notice the increased number of Soviet ships in Cuba by August of 1962. So suspicion arises in U.S. intelligence. U-2 flights were scheduled for September 5, 10, 17, 26, and 29. However, the September 5 flight was canceled due to a blunder of a previous U-2 pilot who was doing some atmospheric testing. He had gotten blinded by the Aurora Borealis just off of Alaska, accidentally changed course to go to the USSR, and had barely escaped by the skin of his teeth. So Cuban refugees had reported that Soviet ships were being unloaded at night, specifically by Soviet crews. Gradually, it became more and more apparent that the Soviets were installing nuclear missiles, medium and intermediate range missiles, in Cuba. Well, now we know. At least we know. From October 15th, Kennedy started meeting with his advisors, formed into a committee called ExComm, Executive Committee. Most of them, including the heads of the military service branches, wanted to go to war. They wanted to conduct airstrikes. They wanted to delete those missiles. Kennedy wanted to know every possible course of action. The committee considered an airstrike or multiple airstrikes, a full invasion, a diplomatic approach, and a blockade. So, of course, the first two would immediately instigate a full-out nuclear war. The diplomatic approach would certainly have not worked for given reasons, given Khrushchev's personality and his tendency to yell people down. And the last consideration was a blockade. Kennedy chose the blockade. It seemed like a middle-of-the-road kind of approach. He formally announced it as a quarantine that would filter necessary goods from missile material in his address to the nation on the 22nd of October 1962. It would be aggressive enough to drive the Soviets to remove the missiles, but it would not push the two powers off of the brink of war. So as you can see, it's just in the middle enough. Here is a diagram of the nuclear missile sites in Cuba. You can see that they're rather extensive. This was taken on October 14th, 1962. A U.S. U-2 spy plane took hundreds of photos of newly built missile installations in the Cuban countryside. This is shown as a map of Cuba showing the Soviet missile sites and the types of missiles on them. So, Kennedy's televised address to the nation was, as a matter of fact, the fastest way to reach the Soviets, during a time when there was no direct link between Washington and the Kremlin. Using this method of communication, Kennedy was able to define the issue for the USSR, as I said, much faster and more effectively than if he had sent a telegram, which is how the actual Soviet embassy was communicating with the Soviet Union. The blockade went into effect 2 days later on the 24th of October. Khrushchev claimed the blockade was an act of war. Dobrynin, who was the Soviet ambassador to the U.S., claimed that a blockade on the high seas or international waters was illegal. So, Khrushchev ordered the Soviet ships, the cargo ships, to stay on course. They were accompanied by submarines that carried nuclear warheads, and the United States Navy was ready to intercept the cargo ships. However, the United States was not aware of the existence of those submarines initially. So yeah, initially Khrushchev had ordered the ships to challenge the blockade, but soon he was scared by the blockade. It seemed that a conflict would ensue. At the last moment, the Soviet ships turned back. Khrushchev starts to see the reality of a nuclear war. So here is a picture of the American Navy, the United States Navy, in its blockade. This next photo was taken from the air. It shows a Soviet submarine on the surface near the quarantine line. You can actually see, here's the submarine here. Here is the American ship. So this photo is a Soviet ship getting intercepted by a United States destroyer. This next one is actually a ship that that had actually crossed the quarantine line. However, they turned back after a U.S. Navy ship started to fire rounds across their bow, across the front of the ship. They were actually harmless rounds, but it had still scared them. So at this point, 1/3 of the United States Strategic Air Command bombers had been put on airborne alert, which means they're in the air, they're surrounding the Soviet Union, they are literally circling around the Soviet Union. The rest of the force was armed with nuclear bombs and dispersed to civilian airfields, and all available ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, were prepared for launching against Soviet targets. U.S. military forces were accumulating in Florida, preparing for an invasion. So you can see how bad this is looking. We have B-52 bombers, this is a B-52 bomber, circling the Soviet Union, ready to drop their nuclear warheads, their nuclear bombs, in a moment's notice. And these airplanes are huge. They can carry a lot of weapons. This is an actual diagram that shows the invasion plans of Cuba. Of course, they're plans. They did not actually happen, thank God. But now, finally, we've got some diplomacy. It seemed as if we're about to head right into war. However, on October 26, Khrushchev sends a telegram to Kennedy in which he portrays this crisis as a sort of tug of war with a knot in the middle of the rope. He said that each side ought to release tension before the knot would be untieable and then need to be cut, as one historian put it, with a sword. Which, that sword would be the sword of war. Khrushchev knew the terror of war. He had seen World War I and had been close to Stalin during World War II. It seems like the situation at this point is beginning to get diffused. However, on the 27th of October, Khrushchev sends another letter, a little more harsher, demanding the removal of NATO Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Kennedy responded in accordance with recommendations by his brother and the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, Thompson. He responded by picking parts of Khrushchev's letters that he and XCOM had liked and leaving the others. Really, they only liked the first letter and it completely ignored the second letter. But, you know, all this time we're talking about the United States and the Soviet Union. Well, how about Castro? Poor guy's been sitting in Cuba, he hasn't gotten a single word. Well, he was pissed about that too. So, Kennedy actually orders low-level reconnaissance flights. This angers Castro. Now, what's a low-level reconnaissance flight? It's a reconnaissance flight that flies at a very low altitude. One historian put it, these pilots are flying right over the tips of the trees. So that was rather annoying. It was rather scary to the Soviets, and it angered to the Soviets and the Cubans, and it angered Castro. Those reconnaissance flights served twofold. They reminded Cuba of American power, and proved that it would not be difficult for the U.S. to invade at any point in time. And as a matter of fact, those airplanes were actually armed with machine guns and some bombs. Not nuclear bombs, conventional bombs. But still, they were capable of doing damage. Also, the reconnaissance flights were to get closer photos of missile sites. However, neither the Soviets or the Cubans received orders to fire on them. However, on the 27th, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet missile. The Soviet crew that had shot down the U-2 spy plane did not need confirmation or permission from Moscow. They had the authorization to act alone, which is what they did. And the U.S. military had a policy which stated that any anti-aircraft base that had shot down a U-2 spy plane would be deleted, eradicated. Kennedy stopped that plan. Kennedy seems he had a cool head, which he did in this case. He stopped the plan. He wanted to see how the situation would play out, and he also wanted a chance to talk to Khrushchev. All this correspondence between Moscow and Washington was happening without Castro's involvement. That night, Castro met with the Soviet ambassador in Cuba. So they actually sent a letter to Khrushchev that said, look, if you need to blow up the United States, don't worry about us. We are ready to pay the consequences. The Cuban people are ready to give themselves up for socialism. They are ready to become totally eradicated for the sake of socialism, and socialism must be victorious. And it would only be logical to get the first strike. So Khrushchev sees this. Khrushchev reads this letter, and he realizes that, it seems Castro's getting a little bit unhinged. He thinks Castro's lost it. Here's that U-2 spy plane. And then here is the captain, the pilot of the spy plane, Rudolf Anderson, who was shot down, and unfortunately he did lose his life. So, that night, we're talking about the night of the 27th of October. XCOM was scheduled to have a meeting where they would discuss final plans for an invasion of Cuba. However, Kennedy told them, look, you guys have all been here for 6 or 7 nights. You have not gotten to go home for 6 or 7 days. He had them go home. He had them rest up. He said, we'll see how it goes tomorrow. However, he sent his brother, Robert Kennedy, to the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., where they agreed that Soviet missiles in Cuba would be removed in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba and to remove the NATO missiles which were obsolete from Turkey. Now, here's the catch. The removal of NATO missiles were not to be announced by the Soviets, and if they were, the US would cancel the removal. So it's not supposed to be staged as if it was an exchange. It was more of a trust me, we're gonna get rid of them, I promise, kind of thing. At this point, the Cubans were preparing to go to war, and they were preparing to be eradicated. There's hysteria in the United States at this point. People are going to grocery stores and buying out all the shelves, emptying the shelves. But Khrushchev agrees to the proposal by Robert Kennedy. On the morning of Sunday, the 28th of October, Khrushchev announced the removal of the Soviet missiles from Cuba. It seemed to him to be his last chance to pull the world back from the brink of war before it devolved into a nuclear war. So both Kennedy and Khrushchev had used their foresight. Both of them had envisioned a thermonuclear war where all of humanity would be ended and eradicated, where the world would cease to exist. Now that is what saved the day. Now here is a photo, an aerial photo of trucks with missile equipment. They're going back to the docks to load the missile equipment onto this Soviet ship, and the removal of the Soviet missiles was to be done under United Nations observance. Let's look at the impact. So Kennedy's public image was significantly bolstered. He appeared as the victor. The United States continued to increase military strength due to the shock of the Cuban Missile Crisis and how much it had revealed the vulnerabilities in the United States military. Khrushchev was humiliated. Though he claimed victory, this was a failure that contributed to his fall from power in 1964. China had even claimed that the USSR was no longer a revolutionary state, and from this point on, China-Soviet relations started to deteriorate. Castro remained in power, and he died a natural death. But Cuba began to remove itself from Moscow, sought to pull itself back from being a pawn of Moscow, though it still did rely on the USSR for economic aid and arms. Now, although the arms race was not stopped, it had actually increased as the USSR tried to get nuclear equality with the United States. Two important treaties were signed relating to nuclear weapons, which is the Limited Test Ban of August 1963, which forbade nuclear tests in the atmosphere, space, or underwater. And then the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, which prevented signatories from transferring weapons or knowledge of how to make them to non-nuclear powers. After the crisis, communication was enhanced between the two powers by establishing a hotline, making immediate telephone communication easier. I will include my citations in the end of this presentation. Thank you very much.